Well, hello, everyone, and I'm really happy to be here with you today and very excited to be part of the Patent 2024 Literacy Symposium, and particularly because this conference is focused on such an important topic, structured literacy teaching and its connection to the science of reading. What I'm going to be focusing on today in this talk is a third related topic that doesn't typically get as much attention as the science of reading or structured literacy, but is just as important. And that topic is the science of the writing system. So I'm going to define what I mean by that. But first, I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing when we use the terms science of reading and structured literacy. And by the way, I should mention that I presented this talk live at the conference, but we had a few technical issues. And so I wasn't able to get through the whole talk. And this is actually then a follow-up recording to allow me to share the whole talk with you. So defining our terms then, the science of reading in a general sense is a term that refers to the extensive body of research that has focused on how people learn to read and write, what might make that process more difficult for some students, and what we have identified from research as the most effective methods to teach all students, including multilingual learners, including students with dyslexia, any student who might have a particular need for additional support as they are learning to read and write English. And I have to add that it would certainly take longer to say this, but we really ought to be calling it the science of reading and writing, because it's actually about both. The science that is most effective is looking at not just the reading process, but how reading and writing interact. And that sort of research has really helped us understand more about how people learn to read and write, as well as the issues that might come up as that process is taking place. So in a very broad sense, then, this research is focused on what is happening in the mind or the brain of the student or the adult as they read and write, and as they learn to read and write. And there's obviously more to it than just that, but we're going to use that as a very big picture metaphor for this body of research. But then sometimes the term science of reading is used when someone is talking about something different, about the teaching approaches that are based on that research. And in that case, what people are really talking about is structured literacy. And structured literacy is an umbrella term that was coined in 2014 by the International Dyslexia Association. And it was coined so we could have a way to refer to the whole collection of instructional approaches that are built on the science of reading and writing, that are informed by that research. And we actually like to say that structured literacy is grounded in that body of research. So structured literacy defines and explains what is important to teach, and also what the research tells us about how to teach it. It recognizes differences in student needs and degrees of teacher knowledge and specialization that are required to reach all learners. So the science of reading and writing and structured literacy teaching then are interconnected topics, with structured literacy informed by the knowledge we've gained from many, many decades of scientific research. So given those two definitions, we can then turn to this idea of the science of the writing system and ask how it relates to the other two topics. And obviously it has important impacts on both, and that's what I hope to talk with you about today. So this term that I'm using, the science of the writing system, is really just a way to talk about the field of study that asks how the English writing system actually operates, and how we as both learners and teachers can understand and use this system that has developed over time that allows us to represent the English language in its written form. So we can look at the writing system then at several levels, and today we're going to be focusing mainly on the spelling of words. And these are the questions that we're going to look at today. So what concepts, conventions, and principles explain the spelling of English words? And in particular, we're going to focus on several key concepts that really open up our understanding of this topic of how the English spelling system actually works and how we can make sense of spelling of all words. Because the answers to these questions connect right back to the goal that we all share, this goal of continuing to enhance and refine the effectiveness of both structured literacy teaching and, of course, the ongoing research into the reading and writing process. So here are the learning objectives for today's talk then. We're going to focus on 3 concepts that underlie and explain English spelling. And to do that, we're going to be looking at data from the system. We're thinking scientifically, so we're going to look at data, which would be, in our case, as we look at the science of the writing system, examples of written words in English to see how they illustrate and help us to understand these 3 concepts. Second, we're going to talk about how these concepts help students develop literacy. And so as we go along, we'll be talking about specific applications like simplifying phoneme grapheme learning, clarifying words that are often thought of as irregular, and then expanding and deepening vocabulary. And there are many applications for this understanding that I'm sharing with you today, but I'll be giving you those examples and you'll be seeing that as we go through the talk this morning. So let's dive into this topic, and we're going to start with one thing about the writing system that we all know for sure. And that is that to learn to read and write, students need to know that spoken words, like the word fish, for example, can be analyzed into phonemes. And phonemes are perceived as the segments of pronunciation in spoken words that are distinctive for meaning. So in fish, we have fish, and we perceive those 3 segments of pronunciation, and they differentiate one word from another. For instance, if we say fish, we have one word, but if we say wish, it's a different word. And so the phonemes at the beginning of fish and w at the beginning of wish differentiate those 2 spoken words in that particular situation. And by the way, the symbols inside the slash brackets are IPA symbols that represent the phonemes I and sh. Forgot to start my timer. I want to keep track of how long it's going to take me to do this. So those symbols represent, they show that we're talking about phonemes, and what's inside the symbols are, or excuse me, inside the brackets are symbols of phonemes. So that first little symbol is not an F in terms of written word, it signals f, and then I, and then sh, and you can see an IPA symbol there for the sh at the end of the spoken word fish. So right away, students have to recognize and work with the individual phonemes in words. And then as they begin to learn about written words, they have to learn to work with graphemes like the F and the I and the SH. Now these we are dealing with inside those angle brackets, we are looking at a written form, a letter or a grapheme or a written word that doesn't have anything to do with pronunciation. So students have to learn about those graphemes that spell written words and their relationship to the phonemes in the spoken words. So this is an essential starting point then for students who are learning how the writing system works. Students have to be taught explicitly about relationships between phonemes and graphemes. Because then once students have that knowledge, with words like the ones on the slide, and obviously with a lot of practice, students will be able to analyze their own speech, just the word all by itself, spoken word, and accurately translate that into a spelling, as long as they also know certain conventions. For instance, when to use a TCH, as you see in the word hutch at the bottom right, or when to use the CH that you see in the word pinch above. And those conventions have to be learned, lots of practice with phonemes and graphemes. But then they can begin to spell, and they can flip things around to read and learn to look at words like these on a page, translate that written word into its spoken form and pronounce it. And as long as they know that word, then they'll be able to understand the word. But things get more complicated quickly, and that doesn't necessarily work for all words. So let's say a student wants to write the word mist, and here's a representation of that pronunciation. And here I have IPA symbols on the right. I have phonics symbols on the left. We have that pronunciation, ist. But the problem is there's more than one English word pronounced mist. The same 4 segments of pronunciation are perceived when we say the mist on the lake, or I missed Annie's party. Here's another example. Tense. Again, we have a representation of the pronunciation, t, e, n, s, and we have one spelling for that, T-E-N-S-E. But again, we have another way to spell that same pronunciation, T-E-N-T-S. And the thing is, we may not even realize that we do not pronounce the second T in this last word. It catches a lot of us by surprise. But if we try to say tent, it's really awkward to say. We almost can't do it. So the spoken word sort of eliminates that second T that we would say if we were just saying tent, and it's not there in the pronunciation. So how is a student then who's just analyzing the pronunciation of a word like tents? We're putting up 3 tents in the backyard. How are they supposed to know there's that second T if they're only thinking about pronunciation of the whole word? And then in the spelling T-E-N-S-E that we just looked at, there's a final E there that doesn't seem to have a purpose if we think about how we often think about a final E in a spelling of a word, and what the job of that E is. So if we think about just pronunciation, why is that E there? Now, you may already know why the E is there, but if you're not sure, I want you to hold that thought because we're going to come back to it. But the point I want to get you thinking about right away is this. These pairs of words, mist and mist, tense and tense, these are what are known as homophones. They are different words that are pronounced the same, but spelled differently. And English has lots of these words. We also have lots of words where parts of the spelling seem to make sense when we think about pronunciation, but other parts don't seem to represent the pronunciation of the word all that well. Words like these, any, many, says, and said. And of course, these examples that I'm giving you right now, these assume that you pronounce these words the same way that I do. And many of you do not pronounce these words the same way. And yet all of us spell them the same, even though we may pronounce them differently. So given that data from our system, what happens if we have a mental model of how the writing system works that is built on the idea that words are spelled, or at least they should be spelled, to represent their pronunciation as closely as possible? That a written word at its core is simply a representation of the pronunciation of that word. And of course, that is a very reasonable assumption to start out with, because the spelling of many words does indeed support that model. We can clearly see that representing important aspects of the pronunciation of words is an essential part of what our writing system does. But does that alone explain the system overall? Does it explain all words? And if not, what else could help us to more completely understand the system that we use in English for writing down words? Because although we know how important phoneme awareness is, and we know how essential it is to explicitly teach students the ways to spell phonemes, the ways to pronounce graphemes, the truth is that when a student is working with nothing more than the pronunciation of a word, they will, in fact, be able to accurately read and spell a lot of words and parts of lots of other words. But there will be many, many more where that's just not enough, and they will be very confused about what's happening with those written words. So as we think about the science of the writing system, we need to ask if there is more to know about how the system works that can help us understand all written words in the system. And that leads us to the 3 concepts that we're planning to discuss today. So here's the first concept. Words have structures. And we're going to spend most of our time today on this first concept because it is so important if we want to understand the writing system. And we're certainly used to thinking about the structures of written language that are larger than words. So here's a quote from a book on sentence structure, and it says, "Writing is basically a system of structures. Words connect to form phrases, clauses, and eventually sentences. And then sentences connect to form paragraphs, and paragraphs connect to create essays, stories, letters, and reports." So this makes sense. We know this, right? We take a word like friend, which becomes a building block for a phrase, my best friend. And then that phrase can become a clause, my best friend called me. And as we go from word to phrase to clause, we're building meaning. So there's no question about the importance of understanding this system of structures as we go from a word upward. But we also need to be thinking about the smaller structures that are inside words. And the universally taught components of words are the letters of the alphabet. But in fact, letters are just building blocks for what we call graphemes. And really, if we want to look at the structures inside words, graphemes are the place to start. Graphemes are the letters and letter combinations that are the smallest units that we use to write a word. And in structured literacy teaching, we know how important graphemes are. We graphemes and the relationship to phonemes and phonemes and the relationship to graphemes. We don't focus on whole word learning in structured literacy. We don't ask students to memorize words as a whole because the science says that doesn't work nearly as well as this idea of, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We teach students to understand written words down to the level of the grapheme and see their relationship to the phoneme, and that's very, very important. But what is often missing, especially in early instruction, is explicit teaching about the larger structural units inside words that are called morphemes. So with the words that we looked at earlier, the two spellings of mist and tense, this awareness of the morphemes, of these written elements that build them, is the key to understanding their spelling. The words on the left side, which my arrow is pointing to now, those words are spelled with just a single base element. And we'll talk about a base in just a minute. The words on the right, though, are spelled with a different base element and a suffix. So one of the functions of a written word is certainly to provide signals of the phonemes in the spoken word, and these words all do that. But spelling also provides clear signals of the morphemes, of the written elements that come together to actually define and create that word. So you may have heard English described as a morphophonemic language, and that is exactly what we're seeing here. English spelling provides signals of the phonemes in spoken words, of course, but it also shows clear representation of the morphemic units in those words. And this matters for both writing and reading, because when we read words, we use the morphemic elements, the morphemic structures in words to help us understand what a word is, whether we realize that consciously or not. And when we spell, the key to getting the spelling right without memorization is often understanding the structural elements that build the word. Because in English, we often have more than one way to spell a segment of pronunciation. And the fact that we spell by combining these morphological elements can help us understand often why a particular spelling is used in a particular word. For the same phoneme, different spelling, why is that? It's often the morphology that clarifies it. So as we start examining the evidence for this first concept that I've just given you, let's establish some terminology. So first of all, rather than saying that a morpheme has a meaning, it's more precise and more illuminating to say that a written morpheme carries or contributes meaning to a word. And it may also have grammatical function. And you'll see why I talk about contributing to meaning as we go along. Second, because morphemes are present in both spoken and written words, it's helpful to use this term element to refer to a written form of a morpheme. So when we're talking about morphemes, we could be talking about spoken words, we could be talking about written words. If we say a morphemic element or just an element, we know we're talking about the written form of that morpheme. And finally, the thing I wanted to make sure we're clear on is that this topic that we're getting into now is morphology. Morphology is the study of the structures, the organizing structures that form words. So next, I want to show you a tool that can help us to perceive and make sense of the morphological structures in written words. And many of you have seen and worked with this tool before. And what we're looking at here is the banner, or the core of an orthographic morphological matrix, otherwise known as a word matrix. And a matrix banner always contains a base element, because every single word in English has a base as its foundation. And this matrix shows the base SAY, which is called a free base element. And it's called free because this base SAY forms a word all by itself, the word say, free of any other attached elements. So it's free in that it can form a word all by itself. Then below the spelling of the base, we see what's called an orthographic denotation, which for this base is speak tell. You see that underneath the spelling of the base, and that is known as the orthographic denotation. Now, this term, orthographic denotation, I always say this when I talk about it, it's kind of a mouthful, but it's a very useful term because it gives us a way to talk about the contribution to the meaning of a word that a base provides without saying that a base itself has a meaning. Because an orthographic denotation is not a meaning in the way that we think about a word having a meaning. Instead, it's a deeper sense. You could almost say that it's this nugget of meaning that was carried along with the base element as words containing it have come into English. And with SAY, you can see that that word came into English, and that deep sense of speak tell is very close to the meaning of the word as we use it today, but that is not always the case. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a minute. So one last point before I expand this matrix. You may be used to thinking of something like SAY as a base word, and you'll notice that I'm calling it a base element. The reason is that it's very important to differentiate between a word like say, that's part of the English language, and a base element like SAY, which is a form of the written. It's part of the written language, and it has many different, there are many different implications to that being a base element. I think you're going to begin to get a sense of why I call it an element rather than a word very soon, but right away I want to just point that out. So a base element is different than a word. So now I've added some affixes to this matrix and another base, NAY, and when I say that we have affixes, morphological elements can be categorized as either base elements or affixes. And there are several different types of affix. We have one type in this matrix called a suffix. Another is a prefix, which you're probably used to seeing. There aren't any prefixes on the left side of this matrix, but you'll see some in the next matrix that I show you. And so now that we've added these additional elements to this matrix, we can form some words. And we can show the synthesis, the formation or spelling of a word using what's called a word sum. A word sum, as you see here on the slide, represents the structural elements that make up a word, and it allows us to show the process that we go through as we synthesize or spell a word. So the first word sum on the slide shows the spelling of the word say from just the base, SAY. And the second word sum shows that we combine that base and the suffix ing to write the word saying. Now, what I want you to notice is that even though you see a plus sign in the second word sum, both of these sums have an arrow in the middle, not an equal sign. And that's because these are not mathematical equations. These word sums represent a process. And in the synthetic word sums that we're looking at now, the arrow is pointing to the end result of the process of synthesizing or spelling a word. We can also use a word sum to show the analysis of a word, as I have right here with naysayer, where we have the word on the left and an arrow pointing to the elements that form that word, NAY, SAY, both bases, and then an ER suffix. So I also want to talk here about this word says, which is often taught as an irregular word, as a heart word. And this idea behind heart word teaching is based in the research. We we want students to be able to read and spell words using everything they know about the system. And a lot of that is the phoneme-grapheme relationships, right? We don't want them to memorize a whole word. In the word says, we want them to understand every part of that word. And much of a word, typically, we can understand using phoneme-grapheme relationships that are kind of the default, the expected. But then sometimes we come across these words where it just doesn't seem to fit. And then we would say, well, students have to learn that part of the spelling by heart. And that's sort of inevitable with some words, but we want to minimize that as much as possible. And so in this case of says, we have an example where if we look at this word as a whole and we try to go from its pronunciation, s, z, to the spelling, then students have to learn at least one and maybe two parts of this word by heart, by rote memorization. And it's very important to keep in mind that memorizing things that seem kind of random and abstract and don't make sense, that can be really quite simple for some kids. It was certainly easy for me, might have been easy for you, but there are so many students where that is not easy at all. That memorizing just a simple little grapheme in a word is a difficult task. So here's the first reason why morphology matters from the beginning of instruction, even with a basic word like says. Because this one syllable word is actually spelled with two morphemic elements. It has the base S-A-Y and the suffix S. And you might say, well, of course, but that is not what we often bring into our instruction with students. But as soon as we do factor that into our instruction and explain it to students, then this is no longer a heart word. Because the structures in this word, combined with the phoneme-grapheme relationships of related words, of words, say, like the word say, formed with just the base S-A-Y, that allows every grapheme in this word to make sense. Students can combine that knowledge of phoneme-grapheme relationships, knowledge of morphemic structures, to reconstruct the spelling of says accurately every single time. Because in the word say, the AY is pronounced exactly as we might expect. It's pronounced the same way that it is in words like pay and play and stay. So the word say is not a heart word. S-A-Y is a totally predictable spelling. And to spell says, then we just take that base and add the suffix S. That's providing grammatical information, which is exactly the same thing we do when we spell pays and plays and stays. Now, it's certainly interesting that the pronunciation of the bases P-A-Y, P-L-A-Y, S-T-A-Y stay the same. Pay, after we add that suffix S, so we've got pay, pays, play, plays, but not S-A-Y. We have say, says. But what we need to focus on is that while the pronunciation of the base does shift, the spelling, which is what students have to learn, stays the same. And in English, this happens all the time. So we really do students a great service when we help them begin to see this from the very beginning. Then they don't have to learn a process of just encoding and decoding words that eventually is going to stop working. They can learn the important aspects of those phoneme-grapheme relationships along with the importance of structure, so they can put that together and it will continue working with every word that they're going to encounter for the rest of their life. Because in English, the spelling of a written element typically remains the same when we add or remove affixes, except for three very consistent suffixing conventions, which we're going to touch on in a minute. But the pronunciation of an element very often changes as we add and remove affixes. And what this means is that the written form of a word is actually more reliable, more consistent, more predictable than its pronunciation. Once we start thinking about morphological structures, that's even the case in many of these words that we think of as irregular for spelling, because in fact, the spelling of many, many words that we think about as irregular are actually totally predictable and reliable, as you can see here with the spelling of says. And so we need to be aware of and thinking about the morphological structures of even some very basic words as we teach children to read and spell. And by doing that, we can significantly reduce their need for memorization and prepare them for all the future learning that they will be doing. So That's a free base element. I want to now show you a bound base element. How am I doing on time? All right. So here is the bound base, PETE. A bound base is one that is always bound or attached to at least one other element as it forms a word. And you'll notice that I'm spelling this base, right? And you probably see me doing that all along. That process might seem a little bit odd because most of us are in the habit of pronouncing a base, right? We might talk about the base ject in the word inject or struct in construct. And it's certainly faster and easier to say struct than to spell out struct. But what happens if we try to pronounce this base? Looking at the spelling, what would we call it? We might call it the Pete base, right? And that just seems really weird. Pete is the name of a person, so it seems weird to say we've got a base called Pete. But if we think a little deeper about the oddness of that experience, it brings to light a problem with referring to bases by pronouncing them. When we do that, we automatically make connections and assumptions about relationships to other words and maybe to the meaning of other words based on a single potential pronunciation of the base. And that often blocks our ability to perceive related words where the base might be pronounced differently, but it's going to be spelled the same, as you may have already experienced with say and says. There's no say in the word says, and so we often think of those as separate things, when in fact they are morphologically related. Now, looking at the base, you may also be having a hard time thinking of a lot of words that contain it. Maybe the one word that I think most people would think of is compete. And that word is definitely formed from this base. But there's a lot more. Here's an expanded matrix. And now we have, I'm going to explain the matrix to you first, and then we'll take a look at the words. So we have prefixes now up in the upper left corner. We have another base, CENTRE, in the lower left. And we have 3 word sums off to the right. So when I was telling you that we sometimes don't anticipate words that might be related, were you expecting to see impetuous and impetus when you were just seeing the base element PETE? And if you weren't, this is an example of what I was just saying, because there's no Pete in the pronunciation of impetuous or impetus, but this deep sense of seeking out or aiming for or rushing at. Do you think that's in the word impetuous and impetus, perhaps? The spelling, however, is right there, the PETE. We'll talk about that final E in just a minute. And both of these new words are spelled with an IM prefix, and that is an assimilated or chameleon form of an IN prefix. So we use that prefix in the spelling of both these words, and in impetuous, you see one other thing. You see a connecting vowel U. And a connecting vowel letter is a type of affix that you may not have heard of before. One reason that we don't often use this term connecting vowel letter is that we can really only perceive these elements as morphological units when we are systematically analyzing the structures of written words. And a lot of traditional morphological analysis originates in the work of linguists, which is appropriate because linguists are the scientists who study language, right? But linguists typically focus on spoken language, and no one can perceive or scientifically test for the presence of a written element like a connecting vowel letter U and actually many others when we're just pronouncing words. We have to analyze the written form itself. The second thing I want you to notice is this slash mark in the bottom 2 word sums. And that is a signal of a suffixing convention, which I mentioned earlier, right? I mentioned that we have these 3 suffixing conventions in English, and I call them the E convention, the doubling convention, the Y to I convention. There are other names that are sometimes used for those conventions, but they're all describing the same consistent changes that are made under certain conditions when we're spelling a word and we're adding a suffix to a base or to another suffix. Many of you know these conventions, and I'm not going to go into them in detail, but since we see the E convention here in this spelling of these two words, and we'll see it again a couple more times, I'm just going to make sure everyone knows what's happening with that convention. So the E convention is applied when we have a final unpronounced or silent E, as we do at the end of this base, and we are adding a suffix that begins with a vowel letter, like this US suffix. And when that happens, we spell the word without the final E, that final silent E, when we write the completed spelling. There's more to it than that. You can learn more about it if you're interested, or you may already know all about it. But that's going to be happening in some of these word sums that we're going to be looking at for the next few minutes. So hopefully, as you look at these word sums, then, given that E convention, you can see the logic of the spelling process. It's absolutely, you just start from left to right, you put the word together, you spell it, it makes sense. And now let me show you two more words that are formed from this base. So we have appetite and we have centripetal. You may have spotted those already as you're looking at the matrix itself, but is the idea of these words being connected to the other words you've already seen, all formed from the same base, is that a surprise to you? It is often surprising to learn that words like appetite and centripetal share the same base element as compete, because the words themselves have such different definitions and usages in English today. And because the pronunciation of the base is also very different, right? But once again, we can see the consistency in their spelling. These written elements are spelled consistently, even though we often pronounce them differently. And I'm hoping that this is where you can begin to see that why it's so helpful to spell rather than pronounce a base element. And that is a practice that I'm going to really encourage you to try out and hopefully adopt, because it really helps us begin to understand morphology more thoroughly. One of the reasons is that, well, let me talk just for a minute about the idea of how important morphology is as we make sense of the writing system, right? Because if we tried to spell these words just from their pronunciation, that would be very challenging for many. But when we teach students to spell as a process of combining these consistently spelled units in consistent ways, everything makes so much more sense. And we can understand, and students can understand, the spelling of each individual element in these words, excuse me, by using the phoneme-grapheme relationships in the overall morphological family. Just as we saw with says, which was confusing, but then say made sense, we'll find certain words in a morphological family where the pronunciation of a vowel is reduced, or it's different than we might expect, but then in another word, oh, it's just what we might expect. So we can combine that knowledge to understand why each and every element comes together to spell a word, and students can begin to learn the whys behind their spelling and be able to assemble words and reconstruct words as they need them, rather than just trying to memorize parts of it that don't make sense. But then I do want to talk about this idea that the words have such different meanings, right? And there's this question, well, how could they possibly share a base? Because we think of a morpheme having a meaning, right? And these words don't have the same meaning. This is why it's so important to recognize that when we're dealing with written morphology, we want to differentiate between a word's meaning and the orthographic denotation of a written base. With the word say and the base say, remember, they were pretty much the same, but that is not what we're seeing here. The definitions, the usages of these words are all very different. And if we were to think of a base as having a meaning and then try to add that meaning together with the meaning of an affix to get the meaning of the words, it doesn't work, right? And when that happens, people often conclude, well, morphology doesn't really work all that well, or we shouldn't go that deep into a word. It's not how the system works. But that's a really unfortunate conclusion, because the morphology of written language is actually incredibly consistent. And understanding a bound base is what unlocks spelling, meaning, vocabulary for so many words. We really don't want to ignore that when we can see how logical and consistent it is. But we can really only see it when we differentiate between the meaning of a word and the deeper sense, that orthographic denotation of a base. Even with these differences in meaning in these words, though, there are important relationships between them. They all have some sort of connection to the orthographic denotation of the base, this idea of seeking something, aiming for something, rushing at something. For instance, you may have already made this connection, but when you're impetuous, you're rushing to do something without thinking, right? When you have an appetite for something, you tend to seek it out. And we could say that an impetus is what drives us to do something or aim for something. But that's not the meaning, that's not the literal meaning of those words. So one reason I was so excited about the chance to talk with you today is that using this understanding of written morphology and its role in the language, we can teach students many different and seemingly unrelated vocabulary words very efficiently, very organically. This can be really helpful with students who don't read a lot, students who are multilingual learners, who have a need to develop a lot of different vocabulary. So it really empowers teachers to help students develop vocabulary efficiently. And at the same time, we're showing students the incredible coherence of our writing system. That's especially important for the students who are most in need of our support. I do want to add one point, and that is that there are some predictable and understandable variations or alternations in the spellings of some elements. And this IM spelling of the prefix that is also spelled IN is one example. You can read more about that as it relates to base elements if you're interested by going to my website, learningaboutspelling.com, and look for the bonus chapter that's a free download. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go along. Okay, so one more thing that I want you to notice in this matrix. Notice that we have a fairly basic everyday word, compete. Most kids are going to learn that if they hear about or play sports. And then we have centripetal, a word that's specific to a particular discipline, and it's not likely to be known by most students. In fact, I remember having to learn the words centripetal and centrifugal in the context of centripetal force, centrifugal force. It's hard to say those. And the fact that they had such similar pronunciations and the spelling, just seemed kind of to represent that pronunciation and nothing more, it made the words themselves seem kind of random and confusing, but they don't need to be confusing at all. So here's an illustration of these forces at work in this situation. This illustration is showing a ball at the end of a string, and that ball is being spun around. And in this image, then, the force pushing the ball outward is centrifugal force, and the force that's directed toward the center, that's keeping that ball from flying off into space, that is centripetal force. So what's cool is that the morphological structures of these words can tell us a lot about what they mean, about why they are used, and how to spell them. So we've already seen the PETE base that's here in centripetal, and we have a second base, CENTRE, which has this idea of center. That's its orthographic denotation. On the other hand, the word centrifugal includes the base FUGE, and that has an orthographic denotation of flee, run away, avoid. That base FUGE also shows up in the words refuge and refugee, among others. And so it makes sense that centrifugal force is the force that moves away from the center, and centripetal force is the force that's moving toward or seeking the center. So this example, I was fun to be able to give you, but it's not an unusual example. We have lots and lots of examples where we can use the morphological elements that build a vocabulary word to help us learn the concepts that the word describes or represents, as we can here, as well as the spelling. Because, and this is such an important point, words are not just a series of graphemes spelling a sequence of phonemes, a sequence of pronunciations that are just somewhat random. Words are composed or built of units that are put together, morphological elements, and each of those units makes a contribution to the meaning of the words. And knowing this has incredible power to help us teach students how to read and spell. When we learn about and begin working with, in particular, these bound-based elements that are so pervasive in the system, the whole system starts to make sense. Now, I'm sure there is a question rolling around in your mind, and that is, how am I supposed to know that PETE is a base and that its orthographic denotation is seek out, aim for, rush at? I mean, that's not something I'm just going to know. It's not intuitive, and I don't see that in a lot of maybe reference books. So how am I supposed to know that? But there is a straightforward process for figuring this out. I'm going to give you just a quick overview of what that process looks like. We're not going to go into a lot of detail, and I'm not going to expect that you could do this walking away from this talk, but I just want you to understand what the process is. So with a word like compete, if we run into that word and think, I wonder what the morphological structure of that word is, we might notice the COM and say, could that be a prefix? And then could PETE be a base? And then we need to go find some data to help us answer those questions. And we do that by turning typically to etymological references. This is an entry from Etym Online. Many of you know this. It's a great free online etymological dictionary. And I'm not showing you the whole entry for the word compete here. I just want you to see that the word goes back to a late Latin word where you can essentially see almost the same spelling, right? Competere there. And the idea was strive in common, strive in company with others. That's what the word used to mean in Latin. In English today, it's taken on a slightly different meaning, but it's got that same sense of striving for something, right? And in Latin, it came from a com, which was a standalone word in Latin, and then was compounded with the verb petere, which meant to strive, to seek, to fall upon, to rush at, right? And the meaning of petere in Latin is where we go to begin discerning the orthographic denotation of the base as it functions in English today. Now, there's more to that process, but again, I just want you to see that that's some of the information we can use to go to find the orthographic denotation of the base. And with the word impetus, then, what we find is that when we look at that, it comes from a similar it comes from an assimilated form of that IN, and then that same verb. Here's our same verb that we just looked at. So because we already have the same spelling PET in the English word compete and impetus, we have that PET with the final E that's replaced when we add a vowel suffix. We can say, okay, the spelling of the base is the same, and now we've identified that they share the same deep sense, that same orthographic denotation, so we can put them in the same matrix. And that's a really quick explanation of how we might use some etymology to help us figure out something about the morphology of a present-day word. And I do want to make the point that an etymological dictionary does not tell us about the morphology of a present-day word directly. We can't go there and say, I'm gonna see what the morphology is, even though it kind of looks like it here with that COM and then that PETERE, but we have to use that and think about it and treat that as information that we use to kind of understand what's happening in the system today. But we do see that with this Latin verb, we can see the origin of the spelling of the base, because that ERE was a suffix in Latin that kind of fell away as it came into English. It was a grammatical suffix, not needed in English. And so we have the PET, and then we have that final E that ends up in many English words. So again, very top level overview of the process. But I want you to be aware that etymology is a very important research tool that is allowing us to find evidence for a base element, and it helps us discern its orthographic denotation, and also to find and verify morphological relationships between words. Now, if all of this is brand new to you, I want to reassure you that you don't have to know how to do this yourself to work with morphology. I've given other talks where I've talked about this idea of morphological awareness, and that how we just understanding how this process works is the first step. Learning specific morphemes, having specific morphemic knowledge is a second step. But the big issue is, or the big first step is, becoming aware that this is how the system works. And first of all, many morphological relationships are very intuitive. You don't need research to validate them. I mean, you may already have known about say and says, but if not, as soon as you started to look at them structurally, it's right there, right? You understand that relationship. And we intuitively absorb a lot of the basic morphology of spoken language as we learn to speak without even realizing it. When a child is saying something like, I runned home, that's what's happening. They're showing us that they are understanding morphology. But just as a child will learn some words without any instruction, there will be a lot of words that they have to be taught, right? Because although we know that as students become readers, they often use the context of a written text to absorb a lot of new vocabulary, but we are all going to encounter words that we can't just figure out from context, right? From being a speaker of English. If I come across the word centrifugal and centripetal, I need to look those words up to see what they mean. The same thing is true with morphology. A lot of morphemes we will absorb without any instruction, but once we become aware of this organizing system of morphology, so many things about spelling will make sense, but some bound bases are not at all intuitive. They are not obvious in spoken language, but they are present and clear and logical in the written form. So as needed, we can turn to references to make sense of them, just as we do with new words. And this is incredibly clarifying and empowering for literacy. I will add that many educators have found that this type of study fits really well into their structured literacy work. They learn how to do morphological study gradually over time, learning, in fact, right along with their students. And often that learning is prompted by their students' questions. And that's certainly what happened with me. I began to learn about this, and every question that a student asked that I couldn't answer prompted me to say, let me see what I can learn about that. And offline, I would go and try to see what was going on and learn more bit by bit. Today, though, I really want to make you just aware that this is how it works, because even without doing research of your own, you'll want to be thinking about how the morphological system works as you use the references and the materials, programs that you are already using. And most importantly, I want you to keep in mind that what's often listed as a meaning of a base is, in fact, more precisely understood, more helpfully understood as an orthographic denotation, as this deeper sense that's carried in the base. So I'm just looking at the time. As promised, we've spent most of our time talking about this first concept. And I do want to explain this idea that I put forth, that morphology is the organizing principle of the system. What does that mean? Because in the structured literacy world, we're used to thinking about graphemes and phonemes as the first most important concept, right? And of course, the graphemes in written words and phonemes in spoken words are the smallest structural units in words. We have to explicitly teach that, have students understand it. But the reason I say that morphology is the organizing principle is that morphemes, written morphemes in particular, are the stable units in the system, which contribute to the meaning of words. Those elements in the written system are spelled in consistent ways, even as their pronunciations vary and change in the words that we speak, the words we use in spoken language. And that then is the organizing principle for the spelling of written words. And by the way, that fact that they are spelled consistently, that's really, really important for comprehension. Our system has evolved over time to help to make it easier for us to read, to make it easier for us to identify words quickly as we read. And that is one of the reasons that we have that convention in the system. All right, so that brings us to our second concept, and that is that the spelling of a word reveals the identity of that word. It tells us what that word is. And of course, part of that is recognizing the pronunciation of a word, right? If we see a word and we recognize, we can connect to the pronunciation. Oh, I know that word. That helps us identify the word. So that is facilitated by the graphemes that give us signals about phonemes. And many graphemes in words do correlate to segments of pronunciation, right? Obviously, we see that throughout the system. But it's important to also know that some graphemes in words have nothing to do with pronunciation. And if we assume that they have to, then we make the system way more complicated than it needs to be. So let me give you an example of this going back to the spelling of the word tense, T-E-N-S-E. Remember, I pointed out that we might wonder why there's a final E in this word, because most of the time, what is first expected when we see a final E is that E is going to signal that the vowel that comes before the E in the spelling is pronounced as a long vowel, as in the words time and bake. But that is not what's happening in this spelling T-E-N-S-E. Right? The vowel in the word tense is a short E, it's an E. So what is the final E doing in the spelling? So we can get a sense of that by looking elsewhere in the system and see where else that E also shows up. And we can look at these pairs of words, brows and brows, laps and laps, and so on. So the words that I've put in each row are pronounced the same. They're homophones. And you'll notice that they all have exactly the same graphemes representing the phonemes, same graphemes, same phonemes, except for that final E in the column of words on the left. And what do you notice about the words on the right? Those words are all formed from a base plus a suffix S, right? But the words on the left are simply base elements ending in that final E. So the E in that words on the left column then is essentially a signal of morphological structure. It makes it very clear when we're reading that those words are base elements and not a different word, as we see on the right, with a suffix. So we can think of that E then as a suffix canceling E. It provides us with a signal about the identity of the word. And we see that same use of a final E in a lot of other words where we could take the E away and we wouldn't necessarily have a plural form of another word. So we wouldn't necessarily confuse it with a different word. But even in those words, it's a clarifying marker of structure. This is a base. As we read those words then, the final E prevents us from kind of slowing down and saying, wait a minute, is that a suffix S? Do I know that word? We just know, okay, base, move on. So that E facilitates rapid comprehension of text, doesn't have anything to do with pronunciation. Here's another example of a letter in a word that has nothing to do with pronunciation, provides a signal of identity instead. The W in the spelling of the number 2 used to be pronounced in the Old English form of this word, but that W stayed in the written word as the pronunciation changed. So we no longer pronounce the W in this word two, but the W stayed with it. And so today we can see that too. We can categorize that, or excuse me, that W. We can categorize that W as a signal of a connection to other words that have to do with the number 2, including these. These all came from the same origin. So we have 2 and twin and 12 and 20 and twice. And the connection to 2 is obvious in all those words. In our spelling TWO, we can see that grapheme W then as an etymological marker. And it reveals relationships to other words that share this idea of 2. So not anything to do with pronunciation. The pronunciation is represented by the T and the O. The W is a marker of its history, marker of connection. So we can think of that grapheme then as performing the function of being an etymological marker. Both of the examples then that I've just given you, the W here and then the E in TENSE in the spelling of tense that ends in an E, those both illustrate the fact that, of course, we know that graphemes correlate to phonemes in many cases, but there are some graphemes in words that may provide different types of signals. Signals about the identity of a word, including signals of relationships to other words in present-day English. And the linguist David Crystal makes this point in his book, Spell It Out. He wrote in that book, the whole point of spelling is to enable us to recognize words when they are written down. And you can see that with these two words that I put below it, right? If I want you to know whether I'm talking about the golf pros that I'm going to be talking with or written prose that we need to read, I have to give you some context when I say the words prose, right? So you know which one is which. But when you look at the written words, the spellings tell you immediately which one is which. And David Crystal goes on to make a second point, and here's what he says. He says, we value spelling if it helps us to recognize the relationship between words. And we saw this with the spelling of the number 2, TWO, and we're going to see it. I'm not going to show you many more today, but you will see it as you begin looking at it, looking for it in many other words as well. So as we teach students about the writing system, we want to be thinking about relationships between words, along with the structures of those words and their pronunciations, in order to help students and ourselves make sense of spelling and understand the science of the writing system. Because words that are related in meaning often have similar spellings. And that may be because of the morphological elements that form them, right? We saw that with says, the structures in the word explain its spelling. We've got that S-A-Y, and we've got that S. We say the same pattern in the spelling of plays and stays. But then we often say, well, what about the word said, right? We've got play, plays, played, stay, stays, stayed, but then say, says, said. It's pronounced differently, but it is also spelled differently. It doesn't have the same structural pattern as played and stayed. Instead, it has an older spelling pattern that we could almost say has become fossilized or has become established in this word. That's a very old, very common word, and it has an older spelling pattern for the past tense, past participle. That is also present in these other two words, though, in laid, spelled L-A-I-D, and paid, spelled P-A-I-D. We're not surprised by that pronunciation, right? Because that AI in the middle is doing right what we think it should do. So if we show students this set of words and then talk about that older pattern, they can use the expected pronunciation of the AI in paid and laid to help them remember the AI in said, where the pronunciation of that AI has shifted over time. So let me give you one last example. I'm definitely getting close to time here. So the A spelling for the indefinite article, as in a cookie, is often taught as an irregular or heart word, right? But that spelling, A, trades off with an AN spelling, depending on whether there's a consonant or a vowel phoneme that follows the indefinite article in the spoken word. So we say that we have an egg, an igloo, an umbrella, but a cookie, a table, a friend, right? So these spellings A and AN are really two alternate spellings of the same morphemic unit, the same indefinite article that we use in the same way in the language. They're doing the same job. Remember, I was saying that sometimes we have more than one spelling of a base. Here's an example, but we have reasons to use both spellings in this particular case, and we can just notice that we spell them with the same vowel grapheme. And it turns out that the word any is also spelled with an A, with that same pronunciation that we sometimes find confusing. And it turns out that any is a related word. We can analyze its spelling as a base AN with a suffix Y, and that structure, that the base and suffix structure that I'm giving you here is actually an inherited structure, because in Old English, the word one was spelled an, and then this y was added to create a suffixed form of the word one in Old English. And it's interesting to think that we used to spell the word one as an. There's a whole lot more that we could talk about with that. But the point I want you to get you thinking about here is that this idea of oneness is still present in the indefinite articles and in this word any. Because if we say to a student or a child, for example, if we say to a child that you can have a cookie, right? And then they have three, you might say, I said you could have a cookie. I did not say you could have three cookies. There's this idea that when you say you can have a cookie, you're talking about one. And if you say, do we have any cookies left? It's really like, do we have even one cookie left? So there is that deeper sense, even though the meaning has changed and the way we use it has become much more specific. The word many, on the other hand, with a similar spelling and pronunciation to any, doesn't come from the same origin at all. The first three words, an, and any, those all have this idea of oneness, but many has this idea of numerous. Historically, this word many had a similar spelling to any, but it had a different pronunciation. But over time, the pronunciation changed to the way we say it now, and it was probably influenced by the pronunciation of any. And you can read about that in the Edym Online entry for many, if you're interested. And we can ask, why would this happen? Well, if we think about how we use the words any and many, it's so similar, right? Do you have any cookies? Do you have many cookies? So these words just kind of came together in their spelling and pronunciation. And this happens often with different sorts of words. Doug Harper is the author of Edym Online, and I heard him make this quote one time, or say this one time, and I quote it all the time, that he said, words have gravity. And I interpret that to mean, I think I understood what he meant, that as words evolve, words with similar meanings and usages may develop similar spellings and maybe even similar pronunciations. So as we think about teaching all the words on this page, then I would strongly recommend that you teach them all together at the same time, so you can show students the relationships, and they can begin to understand the whys behind these spellings. You can essentially then, and by the way, I'm put up here with this build that I've written about this on my website, and also you can teach the word the at the same time. There's a connection there as well. And you can anchor, I've got a little anchor there up next to the an on the slide, and that's because that spelling is the one that is the most predictably spelled, right? We have that nasalized form of the short a and an. And so that we would think about as a more regular word, and that can become the anchor to help students use the phoneme-grapheme relationships they know, and then understand the connection between all of these words. And a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you obviously has come from looking into the history of these words. And once again, etymological resources can help us understand what's happening in English today. But it's really important to recognize that the power of etymology is often not the specific details of the story, but the way that it can help us find meaningful and memorable relationships between words. And those stories are great. I mean, students love stories, but what really can help make that last is the story plus the relationships between words in English today. Because etymology is a research tool that helps us understand today's English, why a particular grapheme is in a word, connections between words in present-day English, and evidence to determine and verify morphological structures. So that is our second concept. We looked at, first of all, at the fact that English is structural, that morphology is the organizing principle. Now we've just looked at the idea that spelling can reveal the identity of words. And one way is by showing us the morphological elements, right? If we have the word mist, we look at M-I-S-S-E-D or M-I-S-T. That's helping us know what the word is. We see relationships between words like T-W-O. And Obviously, the pronunciation signals in the words is a very important signal of the identity of words, but it's not all that's going on. So we're going to wrap up by talking about a third and final concept, and we're not going to have to spend very long on this because the evidence for this concept is including everything that we've talked about so far. And the third concept is this, that spoken and written English are parallel, associated, interrelated systems, but they are distinct systems that have their own structures and conventions. They are not simply translations of one another. So here's a quick summary of what we've seen in the words that we've looked at that is providing some evidence for this last point. First of all, the pronunciation of a word is certainly represented in its printed form, but it's not the same every time. It's represented flexibly. And these other factors that I've been talking to you about often help us understand why one particular pronunciation is there. One of the reasons that we often have different ways to spell phonemes is to allow for the stable, consistent representation of morphological elements in written words. And this is a huge benefit, as I mentioned, for reading comprehension. We've also seen that the spelling of a word may include signals that help us identify the word. They often go beyond pronunciation to include things like relationships between words that are signaled by a spelling and other signals as well. So we can see that a written word is much more than a pronunciation of a spoken word written down. And in fact, written language has its own structures and conventions that we have to understand. So ultimately, how does all of this benefit students and teachers? Well, when students understand spellings, then they can reconstruct them as needed accurately, which will support this process of orthographically mapping them, of embedding them in their long-term memory for both spelling and to support fluent automatic reading and comprehension. And obviously, this is what we want to get to with all words. We are trying to get students to, in a sense, memorize a word, but the goal is for it to become embedded in their mind in terms of the understanding of the meaning, the spelling, multiple meanings, and also the pronunciation. And so helping them be able to reconstruct it accurately every single time, if instead of sometimes says is S-E-Z, because they're trying to sound it out, but they understand, oh no, we don't spell this word that way. It's the S-A-Y plus S. They can write it accurately every time and more quickly embed them in their long-term memory. And the question of the science, the question of how the writing system works, the science of the writing system, is important because it has an influence on both structured literacy teaching and the ongoing research into the effectiveness of those teaching approaches. Last week, I wanted to share a story with you. I heard something that made me want to share it with you because I had put this talk together, but I was listening to an interview with Stanislas Dehaene, who's the neuroscientist, who's the author of Reading in the Brain, and he was talking about learning. He was saying that in our brains, we host an enormous variety of really rich models of different aspects of the external world. And he described learning as the process of adjusting an internal model so it fits better with some aspect of the external world. And that just seemed like exactly what we're talking about today, because what I'm asking you to evaluate is whether these concepts that I've shared with you, whether they fit better with the evidence that you see in the external world of print, in the text that you are reading, that you are working with in teaching students how to read and write, and whether it fits better than this idea that many of us inherited from the culture, I certainly did, that a written word is really supposed to simply represent its pronunciation as closely as possible. And if that fits better, then we also need to ask ourselves when we bring that in. And I really would argue that it makes sense to bring that in from the very beginning, even with young students in an age-appropriate way, because it's going to explain so many of those early words that they have to learn, and it will get them ready to understand every word that they will encounter from that point forward. We often will talk about, well, decoding works for a while, but then we need to say, well, that doesn't work for this word. And instead, if we can frame that so that it always works, we will be better preparing students to be readers and spellers and be lifetime learners as well. So with that, I want to thank you for being here. I do want to make sure you have my contact information, including my website address. At that website, there are lots of links to resources for learning more, and most of them are free. And again, I want to thank Patton for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate being part of this conference. Thank you very much.